Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari. This is Great Big History Podcast. And in this episode, we do part 3 of the death of capitalism and the Great Depression. We're going to kill capitalism in order to save it. Plus, we're going to do popular culture in the 1930s. Superman, Batman, Scarlett OHara. So, there's a lot of words here. I know there's a lot of words. But how does Roosevelt save capitalism? Well, he saves it by killing it and replacing it with quote-unquote socialism. What he's really replacing it with is Keynesian economics. Keynes was a British bisexual, gay, or bisexual rock star of an economist in Britain. And kind of his flamboyancy was both part of the attraction and part of the problem of who he was. And his argument is that government must spend massive amounts of money in a depression to keep people spending. That the government was the spender of last resort. That government must intervene with regulations of everything, especially banks. It's the banks that caused the credit crisis, just like in 2008. It's the banks that speculated. It's the banks that were too invested in the stock market. It's the banks that didn't have enough money in cash. It's the banks that needed regulations. But other companies needed it too, because other companies were doing plenty of regulations. Government must provide welfare for people who are hurt by capitalist downturns. Like, this is not rocket science. The United States had a recession/panic or even a depression basically every 10 to 15 years since industrialization took off in the 1860s. This panic after panic. So Keynes is like, we know it's going to happen. In fact, I've lived through several of them. There was the stagflation of the 70s. There was the recession of the early 90s that got Bill Clinton elected. There was then the internet explosion, or I should say implosion, the tech stock implosion of the late 90s. There was then 2008, the credit implosion, the Great Recession, as it got called, of 2008. And then there was the pandemic of I don't even know, what is it, 2018, 2019? I don't even know when it happened anymore. 2020? That's 5? It's every decade. Oh, and the late 80s also had the banking implosion in the Midwest, the savings and loan crisis, which wiped out huge amounts of banks in the Midwest. And that was the late 80s. So you see a recession every 10 years. So government should provide some form of welfare. Now, define welfare, but how Keynes is defining it as money that helps people keep spending. They're going to be hurt. So it's in everybody's interest that they keep their homes. It's everyone's interest that they try to keep their jobs. Or if they can't keep their jobs, they could keep paying their bills. They could keep food on the table. They could keep going to Walmart and buying clothes and school supplies for their kids. That's in everybody's interest, because if they can't do that, then those businesses go out of business. If those businesses go out of business, then banks get hurt and more employees get hurt. And if they go out of business and they go bankrupt, then they can't pay for their bills. And it's this cycle, this downward cycle. So it's in everybody's interest if government just gives those people money. And we saw this. You lived through it. You got checks from the government during the pandemic. $1,600 per person to spend money. That's all they wanted you to do. Just spend money. Pay your mortgage with it. Pay your credit card. Or go out to eat at a restaurant. Buy some clothes. Go to Costco. Spend it. Keep the economy going. There should be a progressive taxation system. Now, this was started by the progressives. That's why it's one reason why it's called progressive. It's progressive because it is progressive. It taxes people with less money less and taxes people with more money more. But for Keynes, it should be very high on the rich. And so in the 1930s, taxation goes from being 25% of a rich person's income to 63%. By the Second World War, it's going to be 90% of income. And use that money for redistribution to services for the poor because they have less money. Was anybody helped by the Hoovervilles? Is the Keynesian argument. No. Everybody would have been better off if those people stayed in their homes, paying their mortgages, having their kids, eat vegetables and some protein, and going to school. And then going to Walmart or the local county store or the local town store and buying some clothes and buying some goods and buying some cereal off the shelf. Everybody would have been better off. And finally, government needs to know what's going on in the economy. See, part of the problem is that economics is not a science. It's just not. You throw all the money around all you want, but they can't predict what's going to happen. But the bigger problem is not only that it's not a science, but in the 1920s, they didn't even have the data. You didn't even use the word economy. Economy meant other things. But there just wasn't knowledge. Who was working? Who was not working? Where? Why? What companies were making money? What companies weren't making money? How much money? How much wages? How much expenses? How much were the cost of things? Eggs, meat. They had no data. So without the data, you're flying blind. The government can't make decisions without knowing where to help. And so they're going to bring in Keynesian ideas that were not conservative. These are liberal ideas. They're not communist ideas. And that's the major attraction of them. They're socialist ideas. Government should get involved in the economy, which is not what laissez-faire capitalism believes. Laissez-faire capitalism argues from the very beginning that government shouldn't be anywhere near the economy. Well, boom, that's the death. 15 major bills in 100 days. It invents the concept of what do you do in the first 100 days. 15 major bills. $1 trillion in spending. In modern money. $1 trillion in 100 days. Now compare those 15 major bills to President Trump, who had 3 bills in 4 years, and Biden, who is seen as like this amazing kind of getting stuff done kind of president, has 2 bills in 2 years. Like nobody got stuff done like FDR got stuff done. If you get a major bill a year done, you're a successful president. He got 15 in the first 100 days. Massive spending on infrastructure. So the first thing is construction. You invest, and this is basic Keynesian economics. The government invests in things that will help it make money further on. So you get the Hoover Dam. You get bridges. You get the Tennessee Valley Association, TVA, which is going to help electrify the South. All these dams. You get roads being built. You get the PATCO. They paved Haddon Avenue. They rebuilt Philadelphia's City Hall. You get people to work. They spent on culture, not just on infrastructure, which is what the Biden administration has spent on, what Obama spent on, but they spent on culture. Artists, authors, photographers, movies. Walt Whitman's house is renovated, is saved from destruction, and turned into a museum. That's a major change in the New Deal as opposed to what we do today. Obama didn't spend any money on culture to save the economy in 2007, 2008, 2009. No. It was on infrastructure. It was on businesses. It was helping banks. Nobody was helping artists paint more. No one was paying photographers to go out and photograph Americans. No. They weren't paying novelists to write novels. Though all the great authors of the 1930s are all going to be supported in some way, shape, or form with money from the New Deal. They end prohibition, and one of the advantages of ending prohibition is that you could tax the hell out of the liquor. Now, conservatives today will say, see, that's the New Deal is regressive. It was hurting poor people more than rich people. Well, yeah, but it was making money. And now you could drink. You could have your alcohol. There's also social welfare protections. The FDIC, insurance for your bank accounts, allowed for safe banking. Even if your bank went out of business because of its bad loans, you didn't lose your investment. You didn't lose your money. So it was a way of getting people to take their money out of their mattress. You might only earn 1 or 2%, 3%, maybe 4% in interest. It wasn't much. And if the bank went out of business, you didn't lose it, because that was a major part of the freezing of the death of capitalism, was people just sucked up, they put their money in their mattresses. Mortgage security, so that if you lost your job and you couldn't pay your mortgage, you didn't lose your house. Stock market regulations, a minimum wage, Social Security. See, because the problem with the minimum wage is if there's so many people out of work, they'll just work for less and less and less and less and less. So you're competing to pay 10 cents on the dollar. You're competing to pay for nothing. But basically, near slave wages, but slaves don't get wages. But someone will work for almost nothing. Because a little is better than nothing. So the minimum wage was a way to stop that rush to the bottom. Social Security. We will pay old people to retire, to not work. Because if old people retire, then young people can have that job. We'll pay welfare. And really what welfare now becomes is, and it will be this, for essentially the next 50 years, is child poverty prevention. To keep children out of poverty. That was the idea of welfare. It wasn't paying people not to work. It wasn't paying people because they were unemployed. That's different. There's unemployment insurance too. But welfare is money for poor children. That's the definition of welfare now. But welfare is always changing its definition depending on who's talking, when, what decade, whether it's a conservative defining it or a liberal defining it. But for the New Deal, for the 1930s, and for the next, 20 to 30 years or so, well, at least until the 60s, it's a definition of child poverty prevention. Was government intervention in the economy popular? Well, what about all the people who say this is socialist and this is communist? Well, take a look at the elections. Was government intervention in the economy popular? Heck yeah, it was. Roosevelt, who is a Democrat, the party of the Civil War South, the party of Jim Crow, the party of revolution, the party of secession, wins the biggest landslide in 1932 up to that time. Between 1860 and 1932, only 2 Democrats had been elected president. Remember, Andrew Johnson wasn't elected. He inherited from the assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Only 2 had been elected in the 90 years that had transpired? So he wins the largest landslide up to that point. And even the third parties, if you didn't vote Republican, if you didn't vote Democrat, if you voted for third party, 75% of the third party votes went to socialists or communists. So did people want intervention in the economy by 1932? Yeah, they did. This completely changed the party system in the United States. Union workers, white union workers start voting Democrat. Black folk leave the Republican Party and vote Democrat. Remember, the Democrats are the party in 1932 of segregation. They are the party of slavery. They are the party of disenfranchising black folk. And yet black people are going to start to vote for Democrats. They leave the Republican Party of Lincoln. They take the photographs, they take the pictures of Lincoln down, and they start to put up pictures of Roosevelt. Democrats are going to control the House of Representatives from the 1932 to 1994. 62 years of control. And it worked. The economy improved. More importantly, people felt better. Remember, depression is not an economic term. It's a psychological one. Which is why no one wants to call what happened in 2008 a depression. They're like, the Great Recession, the greatest recession. They don't want to use depression because it's a psychological term. But it was apt because what was going on was not just an economic catastrophe. It was a moral, masculine and feminine, psychological trauma. How bad was the Great Depression? My grandmother never ate pancakes again. How effed up is that? But pancakes, how do you make pancakes? Well, you have flour and a little bit of flavoring, right? And you can water it down and water it down and water it down till it's next to nothing. And during the Depression, she had to eat pancakes because they were cheap and they were watered down and they were thin and there was nothing to them. And so as an adult, she never ate pancakes. Remember, pancakes and bacon and eggs is like an American breakfast. Not for my grandmother. Ate pancakes. That's the trauma of the Depression. So Roosevelt changes that. All of that spending, that trillions of dollars in spending, changed that. The economy improved. People felt better. Now, there's the crisis in Europe we're going to talk about in our next couple of lectures, right? So you can never fully recover. International trade could not fully recover. So people will go, well, the New Deal didn't end the Great Depression. Well, of course not. Because the world had suffered an economic trauma. Capitalism died there, guys. And you want to bring it back in 3 years? Like, that's not how economics works. It's just not. It got better. And in 1936, Roosevelt is going to win the biggest, an even bigger landslide. He's going to win 523 electoral votes, 98.5%. There has been nobody who has won that. More. Since Washington, when, let's face it, it was a rigged election. Washington was not going to lose. So that's really before we had a real party-based democracy. Let's just, since 1860, since we have real parties that represented real philosophical differences, there's never been another win as big as 1936. He got 60% of the popular vote. Remember, for socialism, for Keynesian economics. The Great Depression is only ended. The Depression is really economically only ended by rearmament, by the Second World War, which is itself a massive Keynesian stimulus. They are going to spend, for the Second World War, so more money than anyone could contemplate spending. Now, to do that, as we'll talk about, they had to suppress popular spending. They had this basically you couldn't buy stuff in stores anymore. Oh, you couldn't buy a car. There were no cars being made. Anything with an engine being made was going to the war effort. So you had massive Keynesian stimulus where you were printing money, you were borrowing money, you were investing money into the war effort. So that is what creates full employment. The war created full employment. And I'll see articles that are like by these conservative guys who are like, but you can't count the 20 million men who are under arms. Well, dude, they got a paycheck. They were employees of the U.S. government in the U.S. Army. They were working. Many had volunteered. A lot of them had been conscripted. They were pulled out of the production economy to be put into the war economy. But they had a job, and they were making money, and that money was going into bank accounts because they weren't spending it. And that's how you get the 1950s. We'll talk about the 1950s when we get to our part 3. That's how you get Disneyland. Disneyland is not built in the 1930s. It's built in the 1950s for a reason. What about the black experience during the Great Depression? Well, the black experience is personified really by Gordon Parks as an African-American photographer whose job it was. He was hired by the U.S. government to go and photograph and learn about the African-American experience. See, part of the problem was the government, like we talked about, didn't have data. Well, how does the government learn about the African-American experience? Not by sending a bunch of white people to African-American communities and then asking them about stuff. So it's about hiring African-Americans to go and document the African-American experience. And what you see in his photographs is the dignity of work, of equality, of men and women who, not being wealthy, not being rich, but are trying to play their part in an America that is traumatized. So it's the importance of work, of equality, of having something to do. But it's also the psychological trauma of racism. And that is so we have Gordon Parks's American Gothic take, the woman with her broom and her mop and the American flag behind her. It's a take on the American Gothic painting we'll have a little later. Right? There's the deli store worker with his watermelon, right? And all the cans behind him. But then there's the trauma, the psychological trauma of racism. And below that in our video is a series of psychological studies that Gordon Parks is going to photograph where they asked children, they showed them dolls and asked them, who's the good baby? And what these psychologists found was that black children picked the white doll, the white baby doll, as the good one. Look at that photograph. That is an African-American child picking between two dolls, one with black skin, one with white skin. It is a white psychologist holding out the dolls. It is a white psychologist also in a shirt and a jacket. You can see that on the right. It also looks like he has a watch on. It's a male psychologist, right? It looks like they have a watch on his left hand, but on his right, you can see the shirt and you see a little bit of the jacket collar covering the wrist. And the question being asked was, who is the good baby? And you had African-American kids, black kids, picking the white baby. And it was this that Gordon Parks was also showing, the psychological trauma of what racism did to the self-perception of young black men and women, young black children. Now, African Americans were left out of many New Deal programs, anything that was explicitly welfare. Southern states didn't want black folk to get money. And so things like Social Security, they were cut out of. Now, there is no law that says black folk can't be in Social Security. There's no law that could, because of the 14th Amendment, explicitly say that. So what they did was target things. So in Social Security, no farm laborer could be a part of Social Security. No farm laboring job could be part of Social Security. Well, 75, 80% of farm laborers were African American in the South, maybe even more. It was the number one job for African Americans in the South. So if you say this job, which is overwhelmingly black, can't be part of Social Security, you're targeting black folk. Same thing with domestic servants, maids. Well, what was the number one job for black and Hispanic women? Maids, domestic servants, cooks. Now, in northern states, African Americans could get more relief because there was more integration in the economy. They had more jobs that were in factories, in Detroit, in Chicago, in New York, right? There was more jobs that were integrated. Remember, capitalism doesn't care about your racism. So there were more jobs. That doesn't mean they were on equal pay. That doesn't mean they were in equal status. That doesn't mean African Americans were working right next to white folk. It wasn't this non-racial workplace either. But there was more integration, more industrial jobs in northern places that qualified for Social Security, for welfare, for payments, for aid, for construction work. But New Deal programs helped by establishing a minimum wage, which raised black income. Eleanor Roosevelt was a huge civil rights advocate, vocal civil rights advocate. That's the wife of the president, going out and talking to black folk. What president had ever done that before? What white presidential wife had ever done that before? Remember, only two black men had ever been to the White House before this. Douglas and Booker T. Washington, one for Abraham Lincoln, one for Theodore Roosevelt. Yet FDR had a black cabinet, quote unquote. He had a group of high-level black advisors whose job it was to inform all the white people on the staff about the black experience. So when they had a great idea, they were there to be like, yes, but this is how it will affect black folk. And probably the most important part, the biggest change, was the idea that the federal government can help black folk rather than oppress them. That the federal government up to this point sided with the South, sided with Jim Crow, sided with the idea that black folk may be American citizens but had no rights as American citizens unless the state wanted to give them rights. And here was the idea that the federal government can help people. And we're going to see this through the Civil Rights era, right up till the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts of 1964, 1965. The idea that it's going to be Eisenhower, Kennedy, and especially Johnson who are going to use the power of the federal government to help integrate black folk into American life, American civic economy. That is why in our other picture of Gordon Parks, our last picture from Gordon Parks, there's an African-American woman in her bedroom with a picture of Roosevelt. Not Lincoln, but Roosevelt on her wall. Now, that is a woman who is old enough that her parents, if not herself, could have been born into slavery. So to not have a picture of Lincoln, the great emancipator, but to put up a picture of Roosevelt, a Democrat, is a massive, massive change. What about popular culture in the Great Depression? Well, we have three different kinds that we're going to talk about. American regionalism, American escapism, which we see a lot in movies, and then the comic book hero / crime gangster movie. So American regionalism. The idea of the American regionalism was to show dignity of people in the Depression, and it was regional. It was showing people in these different parts. It wasn't just New York. It wasn't just Chicago. It was abandoned places. It was workers in West Virginia, miners in West Virginia, farmers in Montana, ranchers, oil workers in Pennsylvania, in Oklahoma. But the thing that bound this American regionalism together, that we see in photographs, in paintings, in art, in novels, was to show dignity in the Depression. That these people weren't poor because they were terrible people, which is kind of the traditional Protestant work ethic idea. You are poor because you're lazy, because you're not a good person, because God doesn't love you. That's a traditional idea of this. And what American regionalism was showing was no, that something had been lost in the Depression, and it wasn't these people's fault. That something, a belief in America, that a thing they depended on, a hope. And if you look at the pictures we showed from Gordon Parks, is a dignity for the deli owner, a dignity for the woman with the mop and the broom, a dignity for the woman sitting on her bed in her bedroom in the mirror with Roosevelt on the wall. So there's a dignity of these people, despite a melancholy, that something was lost, that art was trying to learn something about America and tell Americans something about the parts of America it didn't ordinarily see. Because if you lived in a big city, you might not know. You wouldn't know what was going on in the rural countryside. If you were in the rural countryside, you didn't know what was going on in the big city. If you were in the north, you might not know what was going on in the south. If you were in the south, you didn't know what was going on in the Midwest. And nobody knew what was going on in the far west, the mountain west. And so it shows America, American Gothic, Nighthawks, where if you look at American Gothic, these are people getting by. There's a dignity in them. This is a man and his daughter. They're not people go, oh, they're husband and wife. They're not. They're a man and his daughter. And they're not wealthy, right? He's in worker's clothes. He's got his overalls underneath. Right? She's in good, dignified outfit. Right? They have a nice little house behind them. They have a farmhouse behind that. He's got the pitchfork for hay. But they're not happy. They're hardly Gatsby holding up popping champagne corks. Right? That there's a melancholy in American Gothic. That's why it's called American Gothic. There's a dignity, even though something has been lost. The same thing is true in Nighthawks. The city is empty. The stores are all dark. The apartments over the stores are all dark. They're all empty. There's no people in the city. You're alone in the city. It's a Glenn Frey song from the 80s. It was played in like Miami Vice. And look at the people who are in the shop, in the little diner. There's 4 people. None of them are talking. None of them are interacting with each other. Shoulders are sloped. They're forward on their elbows. There's nothing. There's not a lot of people. They're not sitting together. There's not a lot of accoutrements. They have drinks, but no food. There's no life. There's no prosperity in the painting. There's existence, but not living. Now we see the living in American escapism, especially in movies. Young Mr. Lincoln, Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, themes of prosperity, of recovery, and in young Mr. Lincoln, honesty. See, because the bankers lied. The corporations lied. They got us into this. I'm just a worker. I'm just a farmer. The bank said it had plenty of money, and it didn't. Everybody told me the stock market would keep going up, and it didn't. That the people we trusted lied. And so there's prosperity in Gone with the Wind. There's recovery in Gone with the Wind. There's prosperity in the Emerald City, right? And there's honesty in young Mr. Lincoln. You have bright colors, which was rare because color film was so expensive. We get these epics, whether it's The Wizard of Oz or Gone with the Wind, or things on the Bible. There's the Mill Exodus movie. I don't remember what it's called. The Greatest Story Ever Told? Is that the Depression one? There's DeMille, who's doing these massive biblical epics. And the idea of this, the idea literally in Wizard of Oz of going from the sepia toned of the Depression, Kansas, and then opening up after the tornado, opening up into the color, the Technicolor, which is super saturated colors of Oz, must have blown people away. And so for a few hours, you're not in the Depression. For a few hours, you're with Scarlett OHara, recovering from the destruction of Atlanta, rebuilding her life, being wealthy again. With the big dresses and the fancy foods and all the wealth. Now, it doesn't mean she has an easy life. She doesn't. She doesn't at all. But it's the idea that you could recover. The Emerald City is prosperity. It's literally made of emeralds. And so American escapism was about showing people for a nickel or a dime a couple of hours of getting away from the Depression. You were in air conditioning. You were in a movie theater. You were in the dark, where you could have this experience that was alone. Even though you were with a crowd of other people, you still had it personally. And that's the interesting thing about movies, is it's a public event, but it's one that you have individually. It's in the dark. Finally, we have crime and gangster movies. The comic book hero, James Cagney. James Cagney is a song and dance man. He's a Broadway star. He's dancing, and now he becomes Scarface. White heat. He's, shooting guns akimbo. He's like a Hong Kong action hero from the 80s. He's literally the original Scarface. A story that will be transformed and picked up in the 70s. And the idea of this is that fighting the system is fun. That in the Depression, the system sucks. The economy sucks. Business owners suck. Law and order sucks. And fighting the system is fun. Look at me, Mom. I'm top of the world. But the system still wins. They don't get away with it. And that's going to be true from the late 20s until the 70s. Like Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid don't get away with robbing the banks. James Cagney could not get away. He has to die at the end. So there's Al Pacino in Scarface. That fighting the system is fun, but they don't get away with it. It's not Ocean's 11. The original Ocean's 11, they don't get away with it. They steal all the money. And they don't get away with it. There's a twist ending. because they weren't allowed to get away with it. They couldn't get away with it. The system still had to win. Otherwise, the worry was you were teaching people anarchy paid, crime paid, right? Walter White doesn't get away with it in the end. We also get the comic book heroes, Superman. Now, Superman is a super Jew, is the idea of him, who's going to fight fascism. Now you say, well, why is he Jewish? Well, he's not. He's a space alien. Well, yes, he is a space alien, but the men who created him, the two men who created Superman as a comic book hero, were Jewish. And Superman's purpose is to defeat Nazis, is to fight for peace, justice, and the American way, is to be the superhero who could help he is an immigrant from a foreign land who has come to the Midwest of America to end up in the city, the metropolis in New York, to help America defeat fascism, defeat racism. So a major part of Superman is his foreignness, is his immigration. He is a refugee seeking asylum from a home that was destroyed. Batman, on the other hand, is waspy. He's a billionaire. He's a rich philanthropist. He's the traditional elite. And his idea, the idea of Batman, is a conservative response to the liberal Superman. So if Superman is the liberal idea that the immigrant will help us, it is the immigrant that will save us, is the refugee, it is the very thing that America does better than anybody else, bringing in foreign people, bringing in non-Americans and making them American. Batman is a more conservative idea. Capitalism will save. Batman doesn't have any superpowers. Batman has money. Batman is a philanthropist. Batman makes a lot of money. Or at least Mr. Wayne makes a lot of money. What does he do with it? He then helps people. Not with welfare, by the way, but with his own technology, his super suit, his belt, his cars. And so we see these three ideas of power, of betterness, of using power. That Superman uses power for good. Batman does too, but he's darker about it. He's more violent about it. He doesn't kill people. Neither does Superman. So they're heroes. James Cagney is the anti-hero. He does kill people. And he gets killed because of it. Superman and Batman don't kill people. But they also represent different kinds of America and different kinds of American power. All right. Thank you. We have finished the Great Depression, the death of capitalism, the Keynesian economics, the FDR and the New Deal, and even popular culture in the 1930s for capitalism, for American capitalism. Thank you very much. Take care. Be safe. In our next lecture, we do communism, the other alternative. So with the death of capitalism, the question was, as we've talked about, what is going to replace capitalism? So the first answer was a more regulated capitalism, Keynesian capitalism, a more socialist, a more government intervention, a more redistribution version of capitalism, which isn't really capitalism, except in its barest bones, that you still have private property in order to make profits. Like that part still exists. So the barest bones of capitalism. But then what happens next is a lot of government intervention, a lot of redistribution, high taxes, government regulations, right? So it doesn't look anything like the capitalism of Carnegie, of the robber barons of the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. It doesn't really look like the capitalism of Hoover or Coolidge. The other alternatives were completely getting rid of capitalism, just complete changes, and that's communism and that's fascism. And the next one is going to be communism that we're going to talk about. So take care, thank you, be safe, and I'll talk to you soon.